Hello everybody, this is David. Welcome back to my channel. Well, this is the next in our series, The Christian Ethic in the 21st Century. And in the last few videos we've been looking at how Christianity came out of the Jewish ethic, the Judaism, which is the Judeo part of the Judao-Christian ethic. In this video I want to begin to look at the Christian ethic, the Christian part of it, namely in how the Christian ethic is characterized in the teachings of Jesus. Before we do that, let's look at a couple of arguments that people use to say, what relevance has Christianity got in 21st century Britain, because Jesus Christ lived 2,000 years ago. What on earth can someone who lived 2,000 years ago be? How can he be relevant? What can he offer us? And these are the kind of arguments they come out with. So what they say is that the oldest parts of the Old Testament date back to about 950 BC or older, and the later part of the New Testament dates back to around AD 120. That's around 1900 years ago, and 3,000 years or so for the Old Testament. How, they say, how can teaching of that age have any relevance for today? For example, no one today would try and teach doctors with Hippocrates as their textbooks. No one would try to teach agriculture on the basis of Varro, or architecture on the basis of Vitruvius. Now, the ancient writers in other spheres are interesting, they say. They are part of the history of their subject, but no one accepts them as authoritative for life and living today. Why then should we accept Jesus? Why accept the New Testament? Ooh, these are great arguments, don't you think? Another thing they say is the Bible, the New Testament, and Jesus came from a tiny country. Israel is only about 150 miles from north to south, from top to bottom, and about 45 miles from east to west. Less than the distance from Glasgow to Edinburgh or London to Brighton. How can an ethic from a tiny country like that be an ethic for the world? And anyway, they say, Israel was inhabited by the Jews, and the Jews deliberately isolated themselves from other countries and other cultures. How can an ethic that comes from a country with a deliberate policy of self-isolation be an ethic for the world? Also, they say the Jews were politically failures. They were subjects to Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. They hardly knew what freedom and independence were. How can an ethic that comes from a tiny, isolated, subject country be an ethic for the world? Again, they say it's obvious that life in Israel was nothing what life is like today. The wages of a working man, for example, were just a few pence. Compare that with how much a working man earns today. There's no comparison. And also the society that they lived in was effectively an agricultural society. There was no industry in the sense of no factories, no machines, no mechanization, no industrialization. Again, they say the ancient world was extremely static. They didn't move around very much. For example, in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 19, we read of Samuel and his mother Hannah. She took the little boy from his home in Ramah to the tabernacle in Shiloh and left him there with Eli the priest. And then it goes on to say that once a year she made him a new coat, and once a year she visited him with the coat. Now, you might think that that was a tremendous journey, the fact that she only made it once a year. In fact, Ramah was only 15 miles from Shiloh. Amazing. So Jesus himself was only once in his life more than about 70 miles from home. So when you think of a society like that, and our society where we don't think anything of going to Spain or India or the Caribbean for holiday, or even driving 70, 80, 90, 100 miles to work and back, it's amazing. So you'll see that society and our society are worlds apart. So how then can a teaching and an ethic given in a society like that have any connection at all with today? Now, this is the kind of thing that come up against the idea of Christianity being relevant today. Firstly, let's just say there's two things that have to be said. Firstly, although the outward appearance, what happens on the outside, how things look on the outside can change, they can change while the underlying principles remain the same. For example, take the case of buildings. There's a great difference between, say for example, the pyramids in Egypt, the Parthenon in Athens, Canterbury Cathedral, Liverpool Cathedral, Coventry Cathedral. How about the Post Office Tower in London, or Telecom Tower now, is as it's called, or the BT Tower, to show my age here. Now, essentially, they look worlds apart. They're all so different to each other. But underlying them all are the same laws of architecture, because if there weren't, they'd fall down. So the externals, or how they look on the outside, can be as different as can be, but the underlying principle is the same. Now, the second thing we need to say is that the one thing the Christian ethic is all about is personal relationships. It's all about the relationships between men and their fellow men, between men and women and God. And personal relationships don't change. Love and hate, honor and loyalty remain the same. How about this illustration, for example? Rachel arrived to marry Jacob, in the Old Testament this is. When she arrived on a camel, dressed in Eastern robes and veiled and hidden. The modern bride arrives in a hired Rolls Royce, or a Bentley maybe, and she wears a wedding dress. The situation is exactly the same, although they look differently. The externals are different, but the situation is exactly the same. Two young people in love getting married. So this is why the ethics of the New Testament and the Bible are as valid today as they ever were. It's because they are all about the unchangeable things, the relationships which do not alter, so long as men are men, women are women, and God is God. Now, if this is true, then one thing stands out about the Christian ethic, in that it is a community ethic. It is an ethic which would be almost impossible for us to live in isolation from our fellow humans, from our fellow men. Love, loyalty, forgiveness, service, these are community matters. Things which can only be found and exercised or done or carried out when people live together in community. Now, when John Wesley, for example, was young and still bewildered in the faith, he formed a plan, and this is quite a few people have the same idea. He formed a plan to get himself a hut on the moors, in other words, in the wilderness, away from people, and to go away and live alone with God. Now, an older and at the time a wiser Christian said to him, God knows nothing of solitary religion. This business of Christian living is something which is to be found among men, among people living together. So now we must ask the all-important question. What is it that characterizes the ethic of the New Testament? Or to put it another way, in a view of what we have been saying, what is it that characterizes the personal relationship of the Christian with his fellow men? Now, before we answer that, we have to go one step back. We have to ask first, what are the personal relationships of God with his people as taught by Jesus? We have to ask that for this reason. One of the main features of the Christian ethic lies in the demand for imitation. We are to imitate Jesus. Peter says in the book of 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 21, he says that Jesus left us an example that we should follow in his steps. The word he uses for example is hupogramos, and hupogramos was the word for the perfect line of copperplate handwriting at the top of the page of a child's exercise book, the line which had to be copied when they're learning to write. So then the Christian has to copy Jesus, and it is Paul's demand that the Christian should imitate God. And after all, is this not a reasonable demand, since man, as the Bible sees it, is made in the image and the likeness of God, as we read in the book of Ephesians chapter 5 verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1 verses 26 and 27. So then, what we really have to ask is this: what is the new thing that Jesus taught about God in regard to God's personal relationships with his people? And we're going to begin to answer that in the next video. So I want to thank you for joining me in this video. See you on the next one. Bye bye.